This is the Policy Digest, a Center for Policy Analysis podcast that explores how African societies are governed and how people and their leaders are shaping the future of their communities. Through candid conversations and insightful analysis, we aim to provide a deeper understanding of the political, economic, and social landscape of Africa. So sit back, relax, and get ready to explore the diverse and dynamic world of African governance.
Welcome back to the Policy Digest podcast series, and I wanted to start this off by quoting one of the most celebrated philosophers of history, that's Carl Jung. He says that ideas own people. It is not like people own ideas. And part of the institutions of inculcating ideas in human history are universities and schools. And in this specific episode, we're going to look at the research dissertation of the president of the country that is called Uganda, who was ruled as of 2024, ruled the nation for what is coming to more than 4 decades at the moment. And his research dissertation, for those who don't know what a dissertation is, it's more or less like your research topic when you are about to graduate at the university. And so his research topic was Fanon's theory on violence, its verification in Liberated Mozambique. Before I can get into that discussion with Tony and Trevor, I wanted to just read just a paragraph for you to test how deep it is. So it opens with an opening line. It says that at the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force. That's by Franz Fanon. In paragraph 1, I just read just a snippet of it, and then we get to the conversation. One, he says, Fanon did not advocate for violence for its own sake. If he had, he would have been a homicidal maniac, not a revolutionary, he says. His writings would not be worth the attention paid to them. He continues by saying, Fanon advocated for violence in order to bring out total and authentic decolonization. He says, decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. He continues, and this is going to be the last statement I'll make. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding. And you can read on and read on. The paper is really huge, and wanted to just get into it. So Public Square has been quite not vocal on the same, but it has been trying to compare the status quo of the NRM government to the ideas of those that begin the movement. And I just wanted you to give me a breakdown of this paper. I know you've really studied it for quite some time, and then we can get to a nexus between the status quo and that idea of the justification of violence.
I think, I suspect Trevor and I have a very diametrically opposed view of this paper. So I will let him take it away to start.
And then you will have a rejoinder
to rubbish what he's saying.
The only thing
I'm going
to say is Fanon was wrong here in the opening paragraph. And I guess this paper, the president was still young, and he felt like this was the only possible way. But before you jump in out to the other ways, which we shall consider after reading this paper, and I'll present to the president, if he's interested, a new framework which
of achieving decolonization.
Of achieving decolonization, because that's like his biggest problem. And also show you how the president has failed to grasp the concept of decolonization, and how his policy actions are the verification of that failure to grasp decolonization.
How his actions now qualify a counter movement against.
Because in this paper he sets out 3 things. Like for people, you read it, but he sets out to describe nativity breaking out of settler systems to achieve freedom using violence, and protecting that freedom that they have found
Still using
using violence. But if the president had understood these critics earlier on and given his proximity to some of the thinkers of the century around these concepts, him resorting to political pragmatism and reinstating kingdoms undoes everything that the progress was done towards that.
How does that challenge the notion of
By
preserving power using violence?
I'm coming to it sort of like I'm not really interested in what he says about using violence. Like I said, he was wrong about that categorically, and you'll have your chance to respond to that.
Again,
Of course, I'm
I'm still questioning why do you think that by him reinstating kingdoms, and to the extent that they are kingdoms, but they are
Define and rule.
They're really shells of kingdoms.
No.
Isn't that in and of itself a representation of violence to establish a system for tokenism purposes? That's itself violence.
It goes
right?
more than that. It's a contradiction for someone who has understood the place of the native
And the settler.
and the settler. Mamdani talks about this, neither native or settler, even and define and rule. Customary rule, the cordoning off of a certain part of a country's traditions for a certain class of people is permanently creating a native class. And that comes with its own challenges, which we have witnessed within our own lifetime. I'm not an old man here. I'm 27 years old.
More than old.
and somehow I've witnessed the degeneration of these relationships that His Excellency garnered, made when he was contesting for power. But he didn't choose to follow his theory, but chose political pragmatism, and that is my stand. But I want people to remember that this paper was introduced to me by my dear leader here, and I want him to do. I was fairly brought in at first, but I want to give him the chance to introduce it and give us exposition to why he thinks this paper is important and why we should look at it.
Sure. Tony.
Take it away.
Yeah. I'll start. When you look at, first you have to frame this thing and know that this is a paper written in 1971. The context is this man is trying to understand the role of violence in driving liberation movements, and he is concentrating on Mozambique. Okay. 71, you had a litany of liberation movements in the global south. If we concentrated on Africa, you know that Fanon did a lot of work on that Algerian War of Independence. You will know that he spoke a bit about the Malagasy uprising. So President Museveni, who I think is one of the smartest students of history, how he applies it is entirely different. But you cannot take away the fact that he's some sort of genius.
You read through the work and
but let's interject there.
it's not ordinary.
Like I say, you can say he's good, that his reading is clear. But a genius.
Yes, in the way he uses
Genius
it, genius could be flawed.
No, but a genius would challenge. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah.
Let me not cut you off. I'm going to restrain myself, please.
Okay, fine. We'll come to that, yes.
Yeah. I would say I made a few notes. In this paper, the president, I think, well, he wasn't a president then. He wanted to understand Fanon's theory in the context of Mozambique's fight for independence. In fact, at some point he says, you need a mind shift of the citizen to move away from believing that the white man is the master, all-knowing, all-powerful. How do you do that without the ultimate deployment of violence, of a power that renders this person weak? In fact, suggestions were made, cutting off a white man's head and moving through the streets.
A kind of Game
is
of
extremely
Thrones.
liberating.
Do you want an answer to that question?
Yes.
And Mozambique is almost a failed state right now. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Uganda is almost a failed state right now. Do you know that? Mm-hmm. Do you know the state that survived all these ravages? Senegal. That the first president understood that violence, and even again, I heard General Tinyefuza talked about this. Their president Senghor understood, and was a poet and an artist, that violence cannot create a lasting political change. Culture does. And we see, and actually, I was lucky to be in Dakar at the height of their their protests. When authoritarianism try, okay, then these guys are sort of doing their thing, but you could see that whenever violence reaches a certain point, they can resolve it.
Actually, then student Yoweri Museveni doesn't object to that. I'm going to read a section where he talks about exactly
Which
that.
number?
29 and 30.
Okay.
He does not position violence as the panacea for liberation and governance, good governance and all that stuff. No. He says to make revolution, you need two sets of conditions, the subjective and the objective. The objective conditions obtain in almost the whole of Africa. It's an objective fact that Africans live in the most appalling conditions, that in certain places like Southern Africa, the exploiters assume a fascist stance. These factors are there and they are undeniable. But the subjective conditions are usually lacking. Now, that is now the hardware-software argument. Now, he comes, and this is one of my favorite lines as activists. We should remind him of this line. 30. It is the work of the most conscious activists to arouse the masses, raise their political consciousness, and give them a vision of a better future and the knowledge and will to oppose the existing exploitation by all possible means. It's incumbent on the activists to make the oppressed people realize the latent capacity in them to smash the centuries-old exploitation and become masters and beneficiaries of their labor. He sounded a bit like Thomas Sankara at this point. It is only through raising the consciousness of the masses that the subjective conditions for a revolution will be created.
Like
this
Karl
needs
Marx.
patient work by the most conscientious cadres. Now,
okay. I'll agree that Museveni.
Yes.
At the end.
So that
Funny what he
directly
remembers.
that directly answers your
Question.
question. It's a software-hardware argument, but I feel like most of the people who interact with this paper take it at face value, look at the heading, and think the man advocated for brute force.
Now, that was
He did
President
not.
Museveni.
When
How about
President
Museveni?
When President Museveni came in, he believed a lot of this stuff. When you look back at the start of his presidency, the man tried to democratize the gun. Muchaka, you remember that stuff?
Oh, yes.
He was putting the gun in the hands of civilians. Basically.
Was he doing any subjective work?
I mean...
Of political education and...
He was busy scrapping them, you know. He was busy.
No.
Okay.
Scrapping political education actually came in later. President Museveni
much later, I think.
President Museveni spent the first 10 years of his government being a teacher. Whether it was public health interventions,
I've seen those videos.
he taught. He went out, taught his people. The credit he gets, chalkboards and all, the credit he gets for rolling back the fires of a ravaging HIV/AIDS epidemic comes from him embracing the role of a studious professor. Teacher. In that he was a student, he was a teacher. His ideas could be contested in the marketplace of ideas. There was no forceful feeding of his ideas on the people. Now, later on,
in the early 2000s.
In the early 2000s, I think he embraced a purely pragmatic approach to governance.
But I want to challenge you on that. He has always embraced a purely pragmatic approach to politics. And to turn back on the paper, you have read his stance on nativity. Yes. Him going against it to achieve military success was the foundations of his political pragmatism that has costed us. And I'll give examples, even when he has ways of getting out of it, he has employed it during this whole court siege. Do you know how many decades that took us back?
Yeah.
So I think he's aware.
Leave alone the court siege, the Chiboko squad.
Yes, but so
whenever
the president speaks, whenever his excellency speaks, he's aware of the objective reality. He's aware of the subjective underpinnings which would be needed to change that reality. But I'm sorry to say, President, I don't be mad, but they have chosen political pragmatism.
But that is
over and over again.
No, I don't think it's over and over again. He has become extremely Machiavellian after at the turn of the around 2001 there. He fully embraced his Machiavellian art. Yes. In 1996, when you look at the contestation of that election with Paul Kawanga Semogerere, the president still believed a lot of the fluff he used to push in the nascent stages of his government. He was a decent man. I don't actually remember many arrests and all that stuff happening. I don't remember the militarism coming into our politics. Then another election later, the man comes around and you hear people like Bidandi Sali and what have you coming and making adverts around Oino Mwana, we call it Dale under Museveni, because now they're pushing a subtle threat of violence on the masses. You had skulls from Luwero Triangle gracing our newspapers.
Oh yes,
it is now
a political rhetoric.
reminding
Let's
people,
not go back to 1980s.
Yes, violence still has a central role to play in our politics. But then it can also be argued, and I know Trevor is going to roast me on this, but it can be argued that this paper was purely an intellectual exercise, not necessarily.
It's true.
Him laying down a manifesto, some sort of Leninist manifesto on how he's going to govern.
But it also helps us. Helps us. It can give us certain tips we can use in our own contestation of this power, and also it gives us a viewpoint into His Excellency's mind at that time.
Yes, and you see,
which could have either evolved or remained.
Yes, later on, I don't think he actually believed a lot of this stuff. I went and dug through some of his manifestos, and I'm going to read for you some things. Manifesto, year on year. President Museveni, perhaps in an attempt to discourage other revolutionaries coming and using the same tactics he used, started preaching peace. I'll tell you.
Started running against his very ideas.
His ideas, which now he can claim, no, I was just engaged in an academic exercise critiquing this man's work. Page 12 of his 2001 manifesto. And remember, this is when he pivoted. He says, our emphasis is on peace, stability, and development. We must avoid violence and conflicts. 2006 manifesto, page 25. The president says, we must promote a culture of peace, tolerance, and non-violence in our society. Okay?
It becomes a Martin Luther.
2011, page 30. I painstakingly picked these things out. Page 30, he says, our goal is to create a society where citizens live in peace and harmony, free from fear of violence and intimidation. 2016, page 18, he says, we must prioritize dialogue, that word, and negotiation over violence and confrontation. And I told you this last time.
It's like he evolved from his old self.
2021, on page 10, this is his latest manifesto. The man says, our vision is for a Uganda where all citizens live in peace, prosperity, and harmony, regardless of their background or beliefs. And then in that same paper, actually, when you go to, I think it's page 25 of the paper, where he says, Fanon's theory does not apply to all contexts. It has to be read in contexts defined by the society in which, quote unquote, this revolution is happening.
That is wrong.
And he calls for careful consideration in its application and says it can't apply across. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of prescription.
Native Fanon's theory comes from psychoanalysis.
Yes.
Psychoanalysis. Yes, you cannot say it applies to Algeria, but his whole aim was he was actually treating people during the resistance.
Yeah, as a doctor.
So his theories have practical ends to addressing violence in context of politics, but especially in colonized societies. And it's good the president hints on it.
Sure. I think let's pick up how Fanon gets to his concept of violence. You could find that maybe the political situation of his time forced him to pick a position, and now we see Museveni.
But no, it's psychoanalysis, and it can be applied in multiple contexts. Yes, subjectivity is there, but above all, psychoanalysis. A genius would have read it that way.
Okay, let's pick it up from there in part 2 of the episode.
No, but
You are listening to the Policy Digest, a Center for Policy Analysis podcast that explores how African societies are governed and how people and their leaders are shaping the future of their communities.
Let's try and contextualize this paper within the status quo at the moment. So, with the current scenario of the state acting as a colonial power itself, and I think we've had conversations here. I think the time we were at Castonia, and you were saying that the NRM parades itself as Pan-African, but the actions are anti-African in the vast majority of instances. So what would violence represent itself in this case? Would it represent itself into protest culture? What would violence in the status quo mean in order to counteract that kind of force from the state?
You want to go first?
I think the NRM is a walking contradiction.
Yeah, it's huge one.
It's governing this country like they are in opposition.
Who let these people be here?
Themselves.
Yeah, it's like they are constantly in opposition of their own outcomes, the outcomes of their governance. And it's fascinating to see. If we circled back to this paper and relate it to the current context, section 32, we have been seeing people go like, well, the state is invincible, it will crush you, you've had ministers come up, was it Kasule Lumumba who said, the state will kill your children and all that stuff.
Please tell them not to.
Yes, so it drives the narrative of, yes, we have the monopoly of violence, and we have overwhelming violence. Now, the counter-revolutionaries that like these guys we're seeing today, if we called them that, these days activists call themselves revolutionaries. Civil society players call themselves revolutionaries.
They're not revolutionaries.
They're hiding in the safe corridor of NGOs and all that stuff. But anyway, I digress. So they come out and say, well, when we lose our fear, they lose their power. Okay? You've heard that repeated several times.
Yeah.
Actually, President Museveni argues that in his paper. He says, it must be seen that the invincibility of the enemy is just fraudulent. He said that he is invincible because he has never been challenged by a revolutionary force using correct methods of revolutionary violence. Of course, he was all about measured violence. It was proportionate violence. Hence, in Mozambique, and remember I said let's limit, an argument can be made that we should limit this paper to applicability in Mozambique.
I'll respond to the Ugandan version, like the question asked, so you go ahead.
Hence, in Mozambique, it has been found necessary to show peasants fragments of a Portuguese soldier blown up by a mine, or better still, his head. He is working towards getting rid of fear. Showing these images, using imagery, is to create a certain frame in
people's minds.
In people's minds that then allows them to overcome a perceived overwhelming counterforce on the other side. It's what we're seeing happening today as well. People are going to march on the streets and probably overwhelm the state machinery and all that stuff. The rules of the game haven't changed. So he says, once the peasant sees guerrillas holding the head of the former master, the white man's head cold in death, the white skin, flowing hair, pointed nose, and blue eyes notwithstanding, he will know, or at least begin to suspect, that the picture traditionally presented to him of the white man's invincibility is nothing but a scarecrow. Now, revolutions succeed when people overcome fear. It was true in the 70s. It is true today.
Do you think people can overcome fear through violence?
Now, that's a good question. The very existence of the state is premised on monopoly of violence.
On violence.
First and foremost. So if you say people are overcoming their fear based off of violence, you're making the assumption that a time is going to come when the citizens are potentially more violent than the state, in which case the state will not exist.
A new state will be formed.
Exactly. So the moment that happens and the imbalance of violence favors the citizens,
yes.
the state cannot stand.
Now let me respond to that.
And I think that's
but look, what you said is very important, Joseph. And let's leave a dot there. Let's just stick a pin.
Yes.
It's very important.
It's very
And it helps us understand our status quo, the motivations of His Excellency back in the day, and the contradictions therein. And like the purpose
The
of
genius.
The purpose.
The genius of the president.
I
insist the man is a genius.
I'm going to present my case, and then you'll see whether you can still have that endorsement. But before I start, this paper, I think the main reason for people to understand why it was introduced is to help us understand an ideas-based investigation of how these regimes are formed and the people behind them. And also within this paper, it's a beginning point for an interesting intellectual discussion on how we are living with each other. So guys, go beyond Museveni, read Fanon, and I'll send some content if you want to attach it to the website.
Oh, yes.
Mbembe is a really good resource on Fanon. Fanon is Mbembe's one of his central influences.
He's hero.
Okay, not hero. This is a serious academic. Central influence. Mbembe is a genius. A genius.
He's a real genius.
Dr. Achi Mbembe is a genius. But anyway, so what you say about the state, if the citizens have enough power, a new state will be formed. That was a thing our dear president was selling, but he took it back to maintain. He did not, like Fanon says, he did not want to remove the master. He simply wanted to replace the master in his own house. So our dear president has not touched in any significant way any single part of the colonial state it was made. He simply entered the mansion, he has changed a few things, he has made it so that he can't be kicked out, but in reality, even things that should have changed in the beginning have only been recently touched on, like this whole idea and disorderly. It's within the 2000s. He has come out to comment on this.
So it's more or less like a white colonial power
Yes.
being replaced by a black
So
one.
the state is real.
But you're describing neocolonialism.
What you're saying is true.
Just now with a black guy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he had a chance to do the thing he talks about. And I think he advocates that Mchaka, if Mchaka, and all this you say was democratizing militarism, as he did, he would have let it reach the point whereby, like he says in that paper, all citizens are now conscientized fighters who are able to check everyone in society with equal levels of violence. But no, and this gentleman wanted militarism for the sake of conditioning the citizens to follow that kind of administration. And he has done that consistently up to today. So there was no anti-colonialism. I'm sorry, Mr. President, but from hindsight, there was no anti-colonialism. What we witnessed was a state takeover through military means. And the state that he took over is a colonial state. And we have seen that in the kind of decrease it has had. And we've also seen that in new policy that the party he chairs over has championed on cultural issues. When it comes down to cultural issues, the things that have been considered are not centering the natives or any of their discourses. It centers colonial considerations, Christianity et al. So if the president is seeing this, and maybe he will, maybe watches SEPA, I'm not going to say mine is just a criticism of him failing and as a result of his his own problem as a single individual. But we're seeing it today. It's a result of unresolved cultural harm through colonialism. And it affected him too. And these contradictions affect all of us.
Yeah.
That is why, personally, my favorite philosopher is a very humble priest from Brazil called Paulo Freire. He said, guys, violence has limits. And even violence traps us in these contradictions. And he has a whole chapter on these contradictions, which can only be solved through culture. And that's why, personally, it's where I like to introduce people to political discussions through Freire's lens. Because Fanon comes in post-mortem.
Yes.
Fanon comes in when things are already at a crisis. Fanon comes in...
Like for us to escape that crisis, we need to...
My recommendation is, guys, come to Freire. He seems easy and almost laughable in how he says, guys, you cannot surmount violence. You have to deal with the cultural contradictions. So that, because when he talks about, he says the actions the oppressed take to stop their oppression are not oppression. But for you to get to those actions, you have to resolve some certain contradictions, which His Excellency did not resolve, which the people around him hadn't resolved yet, which the population he was trying to govern hadn't resolved yet, which we haven't resolved to this very day. So, like, again, I don't want people to get derailed. I think this paper is very important, because even for the president, as a young person, these were his first fruits. So there's no genius here, but it's understandable. These are his first fruits in internalizing these theories. But for the young people reading them today, I think it's very important for us to read him, see those contradictions, and then do the thing that His Excellency hasn't succeeded yet in trying with our peers to resolve these contradictions. Because while violence can also take over a state, non-violence can also take over a state. Once we have a critical mass of people who agree that our state should let go of violence, like his president in our manifesto, this country will change. Like, there will not be enough people to instrumentalize in causing this ideological shift. So, like, they are both sides of a different coins, and you can flip them either way. And when it flips, you can say, it was true, violence what was needed to protect the people. But my theory is that, guys, Mozambique is now almost a failed state. Uganda, we are struggling with the same problems. But all these countries that believe that, hey guys, violence by itself is a cleansing force, have reached limits. Which countries who focus on culture and cultural shift, and even when they have been faced, Sonko and what's the Senegalese guy's name? The guy who Macky Sall was a crisis, you guys. And actually, Macky Sall started this higgy haga after visiting His Excellency the President.
That's another of his favorite words.
In a few months.
That's a third one.
Yeah.
But okay, Senegal was at a very crucial point in its democracy. Crucial. But you can see that they reverted to systems of culture, and it helped undo them. And yes, the guys who are now in power are currently trying to maneuver around, but the principle was maintained. And that's the thing that is lacking on our end. So I'm happy we brought this paper. I'm happy we're having this discussion. But for whoever who's seeing this, I hope this discussion is, how you call it, conscientization. It's a stimulating outlet into searching for ideological
alternative ideological meanings.
The only response I would have is something I've said quite repeatedly, that I wish would have an opportunity to have people have a sit down with, say, the president, and just debate the transition of his thought process from this to where he is now. And then Trevor brings out Mozambique in its current state, and Uganda as some sort of show of how violence as a cleansing force ultimately fails.
Maybe which throw in Sudan there.
Yeah, which comes to tie into
Syria.
what Public Square has been pushing for the longest time, that it's not enough to just push for revolution, push for change. That push for change or revolutionary change has to be built on a solid foundation of knowledge and citizen awareness of what it takes to build a society, what it takes to build a country. Go back to Cuban revolutionaries. These guys worshipped violence. They would their idea of a 3 p.m. fun was to go sit with their friends, have a few drinks, and watch firing squads. You understand?
I feel like, oh, you shot well.
Yeah. Of humans.
While you speak of Cuba, do the critiques simultaneously.
But they spent a lot of time also teaching. Fidel Castro was also like a lecturer. If President Museveni had gone on the trajectory that he started with, 1986 to just before 2000.
So I think this conversation has really went deep into the role of violence in decolonization and how subsequently, if that becomes a currency that leadership systems use, how that has a counterproductive effect. And just as we close, I wanted to still go back to 32, which is speaking about the whole concept of fear and how the proletariat, and I think this is language from Karl Marx, that people who have been previously shackled by this kind of violence through violent structures, how they come to a point and they're like, oh, this person is not invisible. So how do citizens amass such a level of power to the extent that they start to perceive the counterforce as to be a mortal person, no longer invisible? Yes. How do they accumulate that power?
Sometimes being left with no other option is power enough. In the deepest pits of despair, humans find a certain strength because there's nothing else to lose. If people lose their dignity, their livelihood, and everything, then killing them as the ultimate punishment is not going to bring a lot of fear in them. Sometimes when I was still practicing in cancer, there was a line that a certain doctor who came down with cancer in the West said when he was facing severe nausea from a certain drug called cisplatin. He said the nausea is so bad that the thought of death seems comforting. So when people are in that state where the thought of death balanced against the very minuscule possibility that they could succeed and address the issues that have rendered them destitute and desperate, they will take it.
Is it like a natural? Does it come naturally, or it was still caught 30, or is it the work of the most conscious activists to conscientize masses that look here, you're at a critical point in
the activists, because you asked this movement by people being in such levels of unsurmountable desperation.
Is it
or
natural,
activists,
or
but even as
is it
activists,
going to be the work, as Museveni says?
Even the activists come from somewhere. I think that was my interjection. Even the activists, to be activists in earnest, are pushed by some force, and as well as be this, because that's like the overarching thing of like seeing something is wrong with my society, and how do I fix it? How do I commit? To what level do I commit to fixing it? I think it comes from that. I agree.
Yes.
Because for me personally, that has been the driving force, that there are now no other alternatives than to participate.
If you take away avenues of expression, even if it's just venting, if you close all those avenues, what do you leave people with? Now, people who start revolutions and stuff like that are different than the people who later join them. So it's like in business, you have a vision holder. What has moved you to try and solve a problem that other guys haven't solved? It probably been banging your head on a wall and thinking about why something is not working. Okay? Then it's a purely human response. Why isn't this working? That question, why, will ultimately lead you to solve it if you can't find anyone else to solve it. And when you start building the building blocks of the solution, then other people can join you along the way. You can't teach that. You can't teach that. You can teach your vision to other people, but your vision cannot be taught to you. That push to go for it comes from within. So, in the Baganda say, when this person is running from you, objectively, they actually believe you're much stronger. But then when they run out of room, the next direction is to turn to you. So when you reach that point of bravery as a human, and you're like, it looks like I have nothing to lose. I'm out of runway. You're going to fight. It's natural. Fight, fright. That response is inherently built in any human. And that's why it's important.
In the situation where it's there, but then you're like, okay, I'm about to have the action, but the force, the other side is stronger. Do you think activists have a role to play in say, pushing away this whole idea of the invincibility of the enemy?
I will look at activists like you would catalysts in chemistry.
In chemistry, yeah.
They don't make the equation, the reaction.
They just exist at the intersection.
Yeah, they will exist at the intersection of that. But the actual chemicals already exist somewhere.
The outcome and...
Yes. Should activists take on that role? I'm seeing a lot of them clothing themselves into some sort of revolutionaries.
Oh, yes.
I think it's absurd. But...
What's wrong with being a revolutionary?
Well, not that there's anything wrong with it, but I feel like those two exist in different...
political dimensions?
You are wrong, but that will be a subject for another podcast.
Yeah, I feel like they exist in different dimensions. Can it be one and the same person? Is that a role expected of every activist? Because at the end of the day, we might end up normalizing this belief that just because you're an activist, you should also be the one grabbing the guns to
But
go
also,
and
it
fight.
can exist in one and the same person.
Yeah, but it's true.
But it takes a genius.
Trevor, you love that one, don't you?
Yeah, but you know,
Maybe
it can
just to
exist in
close
one and the
that.
same person, but it's a rare thing. But think about people who preach the gospel. If we start this conversation, we might, like Bishop Trevor here. We start this conversation, we might go all day. But you know, the people who preach the gospel are not necessarily Jesus himself or Paul or whatever. They are adopters of the message, and then they go spreading it to bring in more people. But they are vision holders there. I think it's the same thing with liberation movements. There's going to be a vision holder who just says enough is enough. This man went to the bush with what? Less than 50 people or something? 27 guns, and then started building. So what pushed him to the edge? I am tired of what I'm seeing. I am willing to lay my life for it. I am willing to take all this discomfort in the jungles of Luero and all these bushes and somehow do something about it. What pushed him to that edge? It would be a fascinating conversation, actually, asking people like that. He's one of the remaining dying breeds of revolutionaries of yesteryears, and it would be sad if he went without us having certain conversations around that. Like, at what point do you know that this is it?
Yeah,
and I feel that's your question.
Yeah, and I think it was about to be a follow-up, maybe to him, maybe to you, maybe to the audience.
Send it to Museveni and the audience.
His
Excellency.
His was, okay, he normally says that the elections were rigged. The political system was so sectarian that we needed to reorganize the Ugandan society. Could we speak the same of the day?
That's absurd, because I've watched the 1980 campaigns. There were times President Museveni would campaign on the same podium as Rwakasisi.
Jeez.
Yeah. They addressed a crowd within minutes of each other. This one was a UPC strongman.
This one comes in and says, let's not...
He wasn't jailed, he wasn't what? In fact, candidate camps signed off of the Electoral Commission, that time's equivalent of the Electoral Commission. So it's if he went to the bush because elections were stolen, it's debatable, to be honest.
He
because
no longer had the hope that he would...
May I hope he sees this
Get that
podcast
power.
and then he will invite us and then answer some of these questions.
I
'Cause
hope-
we
I
can-
hope-
none of us
What
can
does he
answer.
say about the current election?
I hope that
and
Museveni
the
of
violence that
1970s
comes with
is the one of today. He would perhaps invite us. He used to do that. But these days, he invites you when there's money on the table. when
Guys, if you see this
it's an entire
podcast,
different
like and
conversation.
retweet, so it gets the president. His Excellency.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you
thank
for
you so
coming
much,
to this podcast. It was good listening from you on your views on non-partisanship with regards to public square and on discussing the paper on Fanon and his theory of violence and its justification in liberated Mozambique, but Uganda, we slid it in there, didn't we? Thank you. We look forward to having you another time.
Absolutely.
And keep doing the great work you're doing. All the best.
Thank you, Joseph.
This remains a policy podcast.
Thank you, guys.
Tune in into our other episodes. We are on all your podcasting platforms, Podbean, Spotify, all your podcasting platforms. We're still on YouTube. You can get our podcasts there, and we look forward to having you on another series. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Policy Digest, a Center for Policy Analysis podcast that explores how African societies are governed and how people and their leaders are shaping the future of their communities. For more podcasts, check out our Podbean and YouTube platforms. Thank you.